Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. If you want to subscribe and listen to podcasts, there are dozens of apps to choose from, including podcast-specific apps like Stitcher and even music streaming apps like Spotify. But anyone who works in the industry knows that Apple is the king of podcasts, with its podcast app, which it spun off from iTunes a few years ago, accounting for more than 50% of all podcast use. This is why Apple's podcast rankings can be so important for driving discovery and downloads. There's one master list of the top 200 most popular podcasts at any given moment, and then there's also dozens of content categories, each with its own top 200 list. Making it to the top of one of these lists can drive thousands of fresh downloads and put a podcast on the map. But how does Apple rank its podcast, and what's the best way to make it onto one of its lists? To answer this question, I interviewed Dan Misener, the head of audience development at a company called Pacific Content, which specializes in helping brands develop their own podcast. For over a year, Misener ran an experiment in which he took snapshots of the Apple podcast charts and kept track of which content categories showed up most consistently. I interviewed Misener about his findings and what strategies his company uses to get a client podcast ranked. Let's jump into it. Hey, Dan, thanks for joining us.
Simon, thanks so much for having me on.
My pleasure. So you're the head of audience development at a company called Pacific Content. What is Pacific Content?
So we're a podcasting company, and we're kind of a weird podcasting company in that we don't have our own slate of editorial shows. We don't have an ad network. We don't sell access to our network. We don't sell ads. The only thing that we do is work with brands to create original podcast series that are genuinely good, like audience-focused shows that don't suck and stack up against the best of the best stuff that is out there. So we're not in the business of making, infomercials. We are in the business of trying to compete with the very best content from public radio, from podcasting, from anywhere that you can get good stuff to listen to, and working with brands to enable that.
So you're kind of like a content marketing shop, but specializing specifically in podcasts.
Exactly. And, companies tend to come to us because they're looking for a particular combination of things, right? So we do podcast strategy, we do audio strategy, we do in-house production and development. So we've got sound designers and we have writers and we have chase producers and we have all the people that you would need to actually make a show. And then we do audience development. And that's where most of my focus is, right? Once you've made a really compelling show, how do you get people to actually listen to it? And how do you get the right people to listen to it? Because I think, podcasts are such an incredible medium for building an ongoing loyal relationship with somebody. Like when I think about the podcasts that I listen to, many of them I've been listening for years. These shows fit into my life. They fit into my habits. They are this kind of relationship that I have with a group of people who I haven't necessarily met in real life. And I think that can be incredibly powerful. So we're trying to sort of best position these brands that we work with to make shows that are really, really good and that fit into people's lives in the way that the very best shows from anywhere else fit into people's lives.
Mm-hmm. So I've interviewed some people who have run companies like yours that do podcast consulting. A lot of them kind of do the kind of what we're doing now, just the kind of talky back and forth interview type things. Is that what you guys specialize in too? Or are you kind of like a Gimlet creative that can do the more higher end, documentary style narrative podcast?
So a lot of the people who work at Pacific Content, and we're about 20 people right now, a lot of us have our roots in public media, whether that's public radio, public television, traditional media. A lot of us are sort of coming out of TV or radio or digital audio. And sort of the kinds of shows that we make tend to have really high production quality. So that is, generally speaking, storytelling formats, great music, scoring, tightly edited. Most shows that we work on tend to run in the 25 to 30-minute range. So it's, it's different show to show in terms of what it sounds like, who the host is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we're definitely playing in that sort of more premium audio market.
And just briefly before we get into the meat of what we were talking about today, what's like a single client podcast that you'd be really proud of that you think is kind of your A+ top level, top shelf quality podcast?
I mean, there are a lot of them. We have a lot of really, really great brands that we work with. Right now, we're working with Mozilla. They're the company that makes Firefox, the Firefox web browser. We do a show with them called IRL. It's hosted by Veronica Belmont, and it's all about internet health, which is something that is right in Mozilla's wheelhouse. And it's really a big part of their mandate to sort of create programming and almost public benefit programming to help people understand issues like net neutrality and censorship online, those kinds of things. We're working with Dell Technologies, and we do a show with Dell called Trailblazers. It's hosted by this guy, Walter Isaacson, who is the author of the Steve Jobs biography and the Leonardo da Vinci. Yeah. So it's a show about digital disruption and kind of lessons from history about industries that have been disrupted and how you might learn from history if you are in business today. We just launched a show with Charles Schwab all about behavioral economics, behavioral finance, with a guy named Dan Heath, who's with his brother, the author of a bunch of really great books on behavioral economics, and he teaches this. So, those are a couple examples, but, we really, really like to have this combination of a brand that stands for something coupled with a host who is incredibly credible and can speak with authority on a subject matter, and a storytelling format that really lends itself to the kind of on-demand experience that podcasts can offer.
Mm-hmm. So you're the head of audience development. So I'm guessing that you are probably pretty obsessed with the iTunes podcast rankings. Can you talk a little bit about that and what they are and what they aren't? Because I think there's a lot of confusion about how these things are actually calculated.
So I am one of many people who are absolutely obsessed with the Apple podcast charts. And I think there's quite a bit of confusion or sometimes even angst about the Apple podcast charts. And that stems from misunderstandings about what they are and what they aren't, as you said. And I think the most important thing to say about the Apple podcast charts is that nobody except for Apple really knows exactly how they work. It is their secret sauce. It is their charting algorithm. And for very obvious reasons, they're pretty tight-lipped about how the charts work. The other thing that's really unusual about the Apple podcast charts is that they're kind of different than any other chart that you might see. If you look at the New York Times bestseller list, that is based on what?
The sales within the last week, yeah.
If you look at the Billboard Hot 100, that is based on what?
I don't know. That's a little bit of a... I mean, right, there's like a complicated algorithm that has to do with streaming and sales and different stuff like that.
Exactly. But it's, a lot of these charts that we tend to see, the top movies that came out, or even within Apple's own ecosystem, whether it's books or movies or television shows, like the thing that backs it all up is sales, right? And it's fairly easy to look at the best-selling books in iBooks and understand how that chart is put together. It's based on who bought what over a certain time period. The podcast charts are weird because there isn't this monetary measure underneath it that is obvious to the outside. So any guess at how the Apple podcast charts work is really just that, an educated guess. But what we've done at Pacific Content over the past couple of years is do our very, very best to run experiments, measure what we can, and then correlate specific Apple marketing efforts with chart performance. So we've been able to tease apart.
Let me guess before you. I'm going to guess it's a combination of raw downloads in the last however amount of time, and then completion of the podcast. So how much of people are actually listening to it. And then third thing, the magic thing being something to do with momentum, like something like that.
Yeah, this idea of hotness or recency. Those things play into it as well, as best we understand. But I think it's helpful to think, like, if you were Apple and you were designing this, what are the things that you could actually track? Well, Apple can track clicks into its system or taps into its system. They can track whether somebody has hit play. They can track whether somebody has hit play as the result of a subscription or just a drive-by listen. They can track how far into an episode a particular device made it. Again, if you've opted in, right, this only gets sent to Apple if you have agreed to send them telemetry. And if you're running the latest versions of Apple's operating system, they can track things like ratings and reviews, so star ratings or just free text reviews, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it's almost a podcast trope at this point to hear people say, make sure you leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. Whether that's true or not, we have no evidence. When it comes to ratings, I think largely they are social proof more than anything else, or more than we have evidence to support. But, you can look at all of these signals that Apple could conceivably measure, and it's not hard to kind of figure out what you would do if you were Apple, and if your goal for the charts, as Apple's goal was to have the charts be a discovery mechanism, right? The entire idea of the charts is that they are there to help people find stuff that is good quality, that is relatively new, and that is worth listening to. You do not want to design a set of charts that has the same set of 10 shows always at the very top. So churn is almost built into the idea because it is supposed to be a discovery mechanism.
Now, so they don't want to just have this American Life, Radio Lab, and whatever the other 2 or 3 always at the top, because that wouldn't really do much for their users since they already know about those.
And one of the things that's been really interesting over the past couple of years is to watch those top 10 spots. Because for quite a long time, This American Life and Radio Lab and a lot of those sort of public radio classics, some of those original mega podcasts from some of these huge broadcasters did stay at the top. And what's really exciting is that over the past, I would say 18 months to 2 years, they've been knocked down a peg by some of the upstarts and by some of the sort of non-broadcast companies like the New York Times with The Daily, or like Vox with Today Explained, coming in and sort of competing in the space that has traditionally been dominated by, largely in the US, public radio shows.
So the reason I brought you on is because you actually did an analysis of these charts, specifically the content categories. First of all, explain what those what are the content categories?
Yeah. So when you submit a show to Apple, you get to pick which category you want your show to live inside. So if you had a business show, you could put it under business. If you had a comedy show, you could put it under comedy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a number of these top level categories that Apple offers. And for some categories, there are subcategories. So within business, there is a marketing subcategory. And underneath society and culture, there is a subcategory called personal journal. So there's almost 3 levels, right? You can chart on all podcasts, which is all categories put together. You can chart within a specific top level category like business or comedy. And you can also chart on one of those secondary subcategories like personal journals. So there are almost 3 different levels that you can chart in. So, about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, a colleague and I were at lunch and we were talking about this new show that we were going to launch. And we were trying to figure out what category we should put it in, because it was like kind of a technology show, but kind of a society and culture show. And maybe it would have fit in business.
And we were talking about choose multiple categories, right? But you have to choose like a main category, or like I seem to remember that when I was submitting.
That's exactly right. So within Apple Podcasts, you can pick many different categories to list your show in. I think they will, you're legally allowed to put 3 in your RSS feed, but you will only chart in your primary category. So, or any associated subcategories. So let me give an example of this. If I decided that I wanted to chart in the most number of categories that I was eligible to, I would pick a subcategory as my primary category. So if I had a show that lived in personal journals, that is a subcategory of society and culture, which is a subcategory of all podcasts. And that means I'm eligible to chart in personal journals, I can chart in society and culture, and I can chart in all podcasts. Mm-hmm. So you can kind of chart in multiple places, but only if they are essentially nested subcategories.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. So you're sitting there, you're trying to figure out where you should submit this podcast to.
Yeah.
How did you set up your experiment to see what the actual, empirical data would show?
So we were talking about this, and we were trying to figure out, like, okay, we wanted to know, what is the makeup of the Apple Podcasts top 100 or top 200? Like, how well represented is business in the top 200? How well represented is society and culture? And there'd already been some pretty good research doing a really deep dive into the total number of podcasts within these categories. There was some research done in 2015 about this, which are the busiest categories, which are the least crowded categories, that kind of thing. But we were focused specifically on top performing podcasts. We wanted to know, like, of the 200 top performing podcasts as measured by the Apple Podcasts charts, which categories showed up most often. So you can do this and you can just go and scan, right? You can look at the iTunes top 200 and you can tally up how many of them are business podcasts and how many of them are personal journals podcasts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can go through and do that, but there's no historical data available from Apple when it comes to charts. So what I did is, after lunch, I just went home and I wrote up a little Python script and I said, okay, every hour, just go to Apple and pull down the iTunes top 200 in the United States, pull that down and figure out which category all of these shows belong to and take a snapshot of it. And then I ran it every single hour for about a year. And in truth...
And so when did it start? When did it end?
It started just around February 2017. And
so pretty soon after Trump was elected or came into office, or was inaugurated, yeah.
Shortly after the inauguration, a couple of weeks after the inauguration. And then essentially I let this thing run for a year, mostly because I forgot about it. I had actually forgotten that I had this recurring script running once an hour on my computer. And then, a couple of weeks ago, I realized, I've got a year's worth of historical data about which categories are represented on the Apple iTunes top 200. I wonder if there's anything interesting. I wonder if there are patterns that emerge, right? Like, is there seasonality? Do comedy shows do better over the summer? Or, do business podcasts ramp up at a particular time of the year? Or I guess a better question is, are they more represented on the Apple top 200 at one time of the year versus the other? So I crunched the numbers, and there are a bunch of graphs that are difficult to explain on a podcast, on an audio podcast. But I wrote it up, stuck it on Medium, and it's been really, really interesting to see how people have responded to it, because there are these sort of emerging signs of a kind of seasonality.
Yeah. Well, before we get that, what are like some of the biggest just categories overall that you were noticing? Like, just if you average them out over the year.
Yeah. So when you look at just that first level, sort of the top level categories, of which there are, I want to say 16, by far the biggest category is society and culture. Mm-hmm. It is a huge catch-all. And you think about it, society and culture is a pretty broad topic.
It's almost so broad that you can't even really get any teachings out of it, right? In the sense of, it's hard. It's not like you could craft something around that, because it's just too broad to really tell you anything.
Yeah, you would need to dive down into those sort of subcategory levels, like personal journals, to get much of a sense of breaking that society and culture apart. But society and culture over the past couple of weeks has represented a very, very significant portion of the Apple Podcasts top 200. Business is also a huge category. That's followed by comedy, and then news and politics. If you take those four categories, society and culture, business, comedy, and news and politics, you are talking easily about more than half the charts. So the charts are really dominated by those four big categories, and that goes down from there.
And then, so personal journals, is that like the equivalent of like the YouTube vlog, like the The almost like first person, like this is what's going on in my life type of thing.
So this is the thing is you're really, I mean, nobody's enforcing these
Yeah.
category assignments. These are all self-reported. So I don't even know if you can be that precise about what goes in personal journals. What you see in personal journals is a bunch of shows that their creators thought belonged in personal journals. But there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that could range from exactly what you just said, sort of like an audio blog, all the way to true crime, right?
Yeah.
And everything in between.
Interesting. So let's dive into the seasonality things. Like one thing that stood out to me that I thought was interesting was like a big boost to business podcasts in January.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is just a hypothesis. But if you look around, there is some evidence to suggest that, entrepreneurship really gets a boost towards the end of the calendar year and into the new year. This idea that, people take time off over the holidays and they're thinking about the year ahead and they're thinking, hey, maybe I'm going to quit my job and start a business, or, hey, maybe I've got this idea for a product and I want to try it out. And what was really, really interesting is that when you look at the percentage of business podcasts in the Apple Podcasts Top 200 over the course of a year, there's this gigantic ramp up towards the end of November into December, peaking in January, when some countries say that they've seen, the biggest jump in new small business registration. So it's a correlation. We don't know if people are necessarily going out and, listening to Tim Ferriss or listening to Gary Vee's shows as a way to get themselves pumped up about starting their business in the new year. But it certainly seems like a lot of people have business on the mind, in so much as those business shows are showing up on the charts. It's almost a way of, the way I kind of frame this is that you could use the Apple Podcast charts as a way to look at the American zeitgeist at any given moment in time.
Mm-hmm. And well, did you also see a corresponding boost in like health and fitness podcasts that would kind of lend also to a New Year's resolution type of thing?
I didn't see exactly that, but health and fitness is sort of, it's lower down on the list of sort of top categories. And what's interesting is that, health and sports and recreation have quite a bit of overlap. Those two categories together, I did not see a gigantic lift. But again, it could be sort of not miscategorization, but some fluidity in the interpretation of which category, right? If you've got a show about exercise, is that a health show or is that a sports and recreation show, or is it both? Mm-hmm. And which one did you choose as your primary category?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things I found really fascinating, and the reason I asked when you started this, that it was in like February, is that it seemed like news and politics was on the steady decline. So it happened that you started this experiment, right after Trump got elected. There was what a lot of media companies called the Trump bump in terms of traffic and also subscriptions, paid subscriptions and stuff like that. We were still kind of adjusting to this. It seemed like some kind of norm was being slashed every day. But we see like this steady decline, but it's also happening while we've had lots of like industry buzz around these politics shows about Pod Save America. I feel like every single magazine has now done a big profile of them. And then now we get these daily news podcasts. We have the New York Times, The Daily. We have NPR launched a daily podcast, and then Vox just launched a really buzzy new daily podcast. And these are all kind of news and politics focused. So I wonder what this says about that category and also the Trump effect.
Yeah, I have a colleague who looked at these numbers and suggested that it's very possible that within the U.S., shortly after Trump's inauguration, that we were at kind of peak news and politics podcast interest, and that it just has declined because people are burnt out or they don't want to spend a huge amount of time. Now, one of the interesting things about the charts is that they're a zero-sum game, and you can have a gigantic show like the New York Times, The Daily, or Up First, which is the NPR daily news show, or you can have, as you said, Vox launching Today Explained. And these are, growing shows, and in the case of The Daily, massive shows that are driving huge numbers of downloads. But a spot on the charts, each show gets one.
Yeah.
If any, right? So even if you're doing huge volume in terms of downloads or in terms of subscribers or in terms of actual releases, because daily shows are putting out, in most cases, 5 episodes a week, which is just a huge amount of volume of material, but they still only get one slot, if any, on the chart. So it's not necessarily indicative of a decline in news and politics listening as measured by total number of hours or total number of episodes downloaded. That's really not what the charts are measuring. They are measuring this much, much higher level thing, which is, how hot, in quotes, is a particular category, or how hot is a particular show. So there are ways in which this could be totally misleading, but I do think it's interesting and worth noting that, at the beginning of, the period of time right after Trump's inauguration, 50 of the top 200 podcasts in America were in that news and politics category, and it's since dropped to a little more than half of that. So a pretty steep decline.
And then another interesting trend you pointed out was this huge spike in TV and movie podcast downloads in the summer. I guess that's just to go along with all the blockbusters that come in.
Yeah, well, and I think it's the blockbusters, but also the money behind the blockbusters, right? Like, one of the things that we've really noticed as we've dug into sort of movement on the Apple Podcast charts is that, it's not all that difficult to make a significant dent in the charts if you can drive a focused amount of traffic into Apple's ecosystem sort of in a concentrated period of time. And we see this with some of our clients. They will put out an email blast, or they will put, for instance, Mozilla will put a new episode of IRL on the front page of Firefox, right? That's got a lot of eyeballs on it. And if you can drive those eyeballs into Apple's ecosystem, you tend to be rewarded in terms of chart position. So, a large amount of traffic in a concentrated period of time can move the charts. And what's interesting is that, in July, August, that TV and film category shoots up almost, I want to say, threefold. And, it just happens to coincide with the period of time when a huge amount of money is being spent trying to get us into movie theaters.
So what is, I guess, looking at the big picture, if you're a podcaster, and, kind of like analogous to TV, where TV schedules, like when program appears, what other programming it's competing against, different stuff like that. We're seeing now, as like podcasting becomes more professional, like seasons emerging. So like instead of just having one episode every week, 50 days a year, like there'll be like season 1, season 2, and they'll drop at specific times. As someone who like specializes in audience development, has done this kind of analysis, like what does all this mean? Like, does this mean if you're debuting like a really high, like a really polished culture movie podcast, that you should debut it and you should consider having that in the summer? I don't know, like what, or if you're Gimlet and you're launching a spinoff from Startup, or even just launching a new startup season, should you do it in January when everybody's downloading business podcasts? Like what's the, does it even matter, I guess?
I mean, I think in some ways you could say it doesn't matter at all, because everybody's still figuring this out, and the rules are not yet set in stone. And as you say, the idea of seasons is starting to take hold. People are being more strategic about the number of episodes they drop when they launch a show versus the number of episodes that they drop on a regular ongoing basis. What I would say is that, seasonality absolutely is starting to emerge. We are seeing certain things take off at certain times of the year. And I think that can inform the audience development part of your podcast, but it can also inform the editorial of your show. And this is maybe going to sound like a strange analogy, but I think a lot about Game of Thrones versus Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune. And, like Game of Thrones, when you think about how a new season or half season of Game of Thrones is launched, prestige television properties, there's a very distinct pattern to how that gets rolled out and the buzz and the promotion that goes into that. And the idea is like, you've got a couple of weeks out of the year where you want to make a big splash and you want to build buzz going into that and you want to build anticipation. And there are lots of ways of doing that. But it's like Game of Thrones is a concentrated series that you build up to and you launch it and then a whole bunch of stuff happens afterwards. Whereas Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune are on every single weeknight forever, right? And the way that you market Wheel of Fortune or Jeopardy, and absolutely those are shows that are marketed, and they are marketed very effectively by lots and lots of television stations, is inherently different than the way you market a show like Game of Thrones or any other sort of big budget prestige television show, which I think has a lot more in common with, the way you would launch a movie or the way you would launch, any other sort of big splash kind of event. So I think ideally what I would hope people take away from this is that, yes, there are seasons. Yes, there are trends. Podcasts are increasingly becoming professionalized, and you're going to need to pay attention to more of this. But the way that you create your release cadence, the way that you roll out a certain number of episodes, the length of your season when it debuts, and the format of the show, all of it needs to be playing together, because any bit of this in isolation isn't enough, right? Like it's there's right place, right time to a lot of this. And I think, when you look at some of these cultural zeitgeist moments of, things like Serial, a lot of that was, excellent programming, great storytelling, but also right thing at the right time. And you want to set yourself up for that.
So I wonder, kind of to end with like getting an understanding of how much the iTunes charts really matter. Like I forget what the estimate is for iTunes adoption compared to the entire podcast. I think it's like, is it 65%, 80%? I think it's like 65%. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, according to the IAB, if you take the iOS podcast app and you take desktop iTunes together, I think it's somewhere between 50 and 65% of all podcast downloads, as reported by a number of different podcast hosts. But they are the 800-pound gorilla, absolutely.
So, like, as someone who has had clients that made it onto this list, how important is that in terms of the boost it gives you? And then also, does that translate to the other 50 to 45% of apps? Like, is there a ripple effect across those apps from something simply making it onto the charts?
So it's worth saying a couple of things about this. Number one, there are, for every single category that we talked about, there's a chart, right? And that chart is 200 shows deep. And each chart is different territory by territory. So the Canadian charts are different from the US charts, which are different from the charts in Australia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's not one set of charts. And it's worth knowing like where the audience is and, whether geography plays into it. So I would say like being at spot 198 in personal journals, the subcategory of society and culture, is probably not a huge deal and is not going to move the needle for most people. It's nice to have your show on the top 200 within a category. It makes for a nice screenshot, and you can tell your friends that your show is in the top 200.
Reminds me of Amazon's book categories where they go to increasingly like niche things that absolutely you could be number one in some obscure niche, and it means absolutely nothing.
So appearing on the charts is always a nice thing and usually makes for a nice screenshot. So that's a good thing. I would say where it makes the biggest difference is when you are in the top 10 of any of those primary categories, those first level categories. So if you're in the top 10 of business, if you're in the top 10 of technology, what happens is there's a virtuous cycle. There is a positive feedback loop where people use these charts as a discovery mechanism. And you can think about your own behavior. If you're an iOS podcast user or you're a desktop iTunes user, sometimes I just click around and look in the different categories that I'm interested in to try and find new stuff that's interesting.
It's funny. I'm just the opposite. Top 10, I looked at the charts for the first time in a long time just before this interview to prepare for. I usually only get if I only downloaded a new podcast if it's like word of mouth or if I read about it somewhere.
If you talk to the folks at Apple, they will tell you that a huge amount of podcast discovery happens within their apps, either through their curated editorial front pages, but also through these charts. And these charts, the top 10, they have a privileged position, right? They get bigger cover art. They are more prominently displayed within the app. So I would say being in the top 10 of any top level category will probably move the needle and will very likely result in a kind of positive feedback loop because you have this presence which people use to find new shows, and then their engagement keeps you to the top of the list. So there's sort of a stickiness there that's worth trying to get.
And does that positive feedback loop reverberate outside of iTunes, or is it mainly there?
So what's interesting is that the Apple Podcasts directory and their charts have been used by a ton of third-party podcast apps, right? Who essentially piggyback on top of the charts because the charts are available through a standard API, and because the Apple Podcasts directory, they've got a search API that lets you pull down a whole bunch of metadata about shows. So, many third-party podcast apps use the iTunes as sort of the de facto canonical listing of all podcasts in the universe. So yes, if you show up in the top 10 in a particular category in iTunes, there are a handful of third-party apps that are going to mirror or mimic exactly what iTunes or Apple Podcasts on the iPhone or iPad is showing. So yes, there are these ripples that we totally see.
Okay, Dan. Well, those were all the questions I had. Where can people find you?
So you can find me on Twitter at Misener, Misener, and you can find Pacific Content at pacific-content.com.
Great. Well, thanks so much. It was a fantastic conversation. I learned a lot.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Okay. That's all I have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.